Hey, it's 106 in the Twin Cities and also in Waco, Texas. And that's important because on the line is our guest for this first part of the second hour, Roger E. Olson. Roger's going to join us here with a conversation that we try to have in the second hour on the program here. We try to have a long conversation with a theologian, with scientists, with thinkers, with musicians, with people who are trying to create
beekeepers,
a way of life in the world and a way of Christian thought in the world that we live in. And Roger is a professor of theology at Truett Seminary, which is part of Baylor University.
Yeah, I think Roger needs to read some books.
Roger is quite
erudite.
And he's written a series of blog posts, and this is why I invited him to be on the show. And they're part of a forthcoming book called Against Calvinism, trying to, in his words, rescue evangelicalism from a particular worldview. So, Roger, thanks for being on the program. As you know, I'm Doug. We know each other. But John Music, the sidekick, was the other one talking there. So, thanks for being on the program.
Good. Well, it's good to be with you. And I thought when you said 106, you were telling the temperature in Waco.
Is it 106? Because it's a beautiful 79 degrees in Minneapolis today.
It's going to be 106 today. I was up in Dallas the other day, and it was 114.
My goodness.
So that's our summer in Texas.
Yeah, and how many days in a row have you topped 100 degrees? Are they still counting?
30-some.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And isn't it something to think that
normally
people...
hot here in the summer, but not this bad.
Yeah, and to think that people lived there in the 1910s and 1930s
Right.
before there was air conditioning. Maybe there weren't as many people living there.
No basements to go to either.
Well, Roger, I'm so glad you're on the show, and to give a little bit of background to people who would be listening and maybe don't know and don't sort of geek out like you and I might do on the ins and outs of religion in America. Evangelicalism is this big category that for the last 60, 70 years has captured a large portion of American Protestantism. And there's people from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the ELCA, which is big here in the Twin Cities, so they start with evangelical in their name, to the National Association of Evangelicals, to Jimmy Carter being declared, as a president in 1976, the year of the evangelical. There's this whole category of evangelicalism, which to an outsider might all look the same, might sort of look like an amorphous group of the same thing. And you'll hear from certain representatives who are quite proud to say, we are evangelicals and we will tell you what it means to be evangelicals. But there is a bit of a wrestling match. There's a bit of a duel. There's a little bit of an argument going on within that group, a very large group of Christians in America, about, well, what are the requirements and what are the restrictions around what it means to be an evangelical? And you have picked on up on the fact that there's one tribe within that larger group that tend to come from a Calvinist, Reformed background that are trying to really put stakes in the ground to say, we will define what it means to be evangelical. And you think that's a problem. And so you're trying to raise conversations about how that's not the only way to think about it. Do I have that somewhat right in my...
You said it all. I don't know what else there is to say.
No. Well, I think there's a lot to say because
boy,
Okay.
Roger, Doug has a tendency to do that, I believe.
Well, no, I just try to set it up for our
Set it up. You baked the cake and iced it.
No, I didn't.
Roger's just going to be listening from now on.
No. Okay. So if that's the circumstance, right? That's the dilemma. I when I want to be fiery about it, I'll say there's this little cabal of folks that are getting together to tell all the rest of us what it means to be evangelical, and if we're not like them, then we're not one. And you've chosen to take this on in both a professional, academic, and kind of pastoral way to say, no, there needs to be something else in that. Tell us why you think that's important and what you're up to.
Well, evangelicalism, as I mean it when I use the word, usually refers to the stream of Protestant Christianity, though I don't exclude Catholics necessarily, but it goes back to the Great Awakening of the 1740s. And the two great-granddaddies of evangelicalism as a religious type in America are Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley. They were both born in 1703. Now, in 2003, there was a lot of talk about Jonathan Edwards and not as much about John Wesley, unfortunately. And I want to hold them both together. Now, Jonathan Edwards, of course, most people know as the Puritan preacher of sinners in the hands of an angry God, and he was that, but he was also a philosopher and a theologian and a biblical scholar and even a scientist.
Hey, did Wesley?
He was a brilliant man.
Did Wesley and Edwards die on the same day, like Jefferson and Adams?
No, they were just born in the same year.
Okay,
born in the same year.
Edwards died quite a bit younger than Wesley did, and as far as we know, they never met, but they did know of each other. Edwards was the Calvinist. He was what we call a 5-point Calvinist or a high Calvinist. He believed in limited atonement, that Christ died only for the elect, that God selected certain people to be saved before he even created the world and so forth. John Wesley was an Arminian, that is, someone who believes that God doesn't pre-select who's going to be saved, but offers people his grace and leaves it up to them to accept or reject it. Now, those two streams, in all their varieties, but those two general streams have been in the evangelical community ever since Edwards and Wesley. But there's always been a tug of war, too, and it kind of has its ups and downs. Sometimes it quietens down, that is the conversation, the argument about it, and then it comes back. And in the last 20 to 25 years, it's come back with a vengeance among evangelicals, especially among evangelical scholars and movers and shakers. I don't know, how much this filters down to the pews, although I think it does in certain ways. They may not really understand what's going on, but the evangelical community has sort of been shaking out, let's say, in terms of either you're Calvinist or you're Arminian, and Calvinists especially like to say they're really the sort of norm for all of evangelicalism. I don't hear Arminians saying that as much. And so what I'm trying to do is simply bring attention to the fact that poor Wesley, who didn't get talked about very much in 2003, except among Methodists, because he was the founder of the Methodist tradition. But I want to bring the memory of him and of Arminianism back as a legitimate, equal partner in what it means to be evangelical.
Now, why do you think that's come back with such a vengeance? Do you have a sense, and not stealing from your book that's forthcoming? It's coming out in the next few months. Is that
October.
Right? And it's called Against Calvinism:
Right.
Rescuing God's Reputation from Radical Reform Theology.
Right.
Yeah. So
Rescuing God's Reputation from Radical Reform Theology was my subtitle. The publisher dropped the subtitle, and it's just called Against Calvinism. But I think they're going to put that on the back cover or something like that.
And why do you think there's been this return to this particular view? And Calvinism, to give a little context to it, that was a theological innovation by a guy named John Calvin. And these people are all named Johns, which sort of makes me think this should have been called Johnnyism or something instead of evangelicalism. But John Calvin was a theological entrepreneur and thinker and scholar in his own day. And then guys like Edwards pick up in that tradition. Why do you think that particular tradition has enraptured so many people in the last 20 or 25 years to be so aggressive about putting forth that particular theological viewpoint and telling others, hey, if you're not in on that, you're really not in on the deal? What do you think it is about our culture?
There are personalities who are very Calvinistic. One of them is right there in Minneapolis, but there are others scattered around the country who have written books that have been very popular. And I think that one of the things that we would agree on, that is, they and I would agree on, is that evangelicalism over the last, say, 25, 30 years has kind of lost its theological depth, you might say. It's become somewhat shallow theologically. And so they've stepped in, and I don't fault them for this, and said, here's a theology for those of you who want one, and you really need one, whether you know it or not, and it answers all your major questions. It wraps the gospel up in a nice system, and here it is. It's very rational, it's very biblical, and once you get inside the system, everything becomes clear. And that's the appeal of Calvinism to many people, and there have been some really loud, notable personalities among evangelicals who have really raised their voices to say that in the last 25 years with tremendous success, especially among young men in their late teens and 20s.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because it does seem that this is a movement that strikes at a particular people group, young men in their 20s or maybe early 30s, like you're saying. Do you think there's something about that stage of life or that cultural group that makes this particular theological view attractive? Because a bunch of us have been writing books, right? It's not just that it's not like these are the only folks writing books or running radio shows. But why why is there such an attraction? Do you have a I suppose on why young men at that age find this particular view so attractive?
Well, I've been tempted to call it testosterone theology because it is so popular among young men. But I think the reason is because it gives an idea of God as very powerful, as very controlling, as I almost want to say manipulative, and from my view it is, but I don't think that's necessarily what the young men who adopt it would say. But it does give them permission, in my opinion. It gives them permission to be that way. Because if God is that way and we're created in God's image, then why couldn't we be that way too? And let's face it, most young men in America have a natural kind of tendency to want to be powerful, if not controlling, of those around them. And
watch it, Roger, or I'll crush you.
Yeah. Okay, Roger, hang on with us through the break. I think this is really interesting, and I think it's helpful for people. And I'd love to talk a little bit about what you are suggesting as an alternative way for evangelicalism to move forward in the world with a more open sensibility to it when we come here after the break. Folks, if you want to follow up on any of this, you can go to the Doug Pagitt radio page on Facebook, and you can find a link to Roger Olson. He blogs over at Pathos, which is a website we've talked about here on the program a number of times. So you can follow his blog posts there. You can also pick up his books and all the rest of that. We're going to be back here after the break with Roger Olson talking about maybe the future of evangelicalism from his perspective and what hope there might be for those of us who can't plug into that story as it's been laid out by so many loud voices in the last 25 years. So stick with us here on AM 950 and DougPagittRadio.com.